Hello and welcome to the Spike podcast. I'm Fraser Myers, and back with me today are Spike's deputy editor and host of the Last Orders podcast, Tom Slater.
Hello.
And Spike columnist Ella Whelan.
Hi.
Coming up on the show today, we'll be talking new parties, the row between France and Italy, and campus censorship.
Party insiders are talking about an anti-Brexit campaign to occupy the political middle ground.
New anti-Brexit parties has officially launched.
After what many would say is the shambles of Brexit, would voters in the UK be open to a centrist party?
Nigel Farage has announced his official return to the Brexit fray this morning. The former leader of UKIP says it would be negligent to stand by and watch MPs wreck Britain's bid to leave the European Union.
According to a recent Comres poll, 79% of voters think that most politicians do not take into account the views and concerns of ordinary people. 64% of voters say today's parties do not offer me an appealing choice of who to vote for. So if the established parties aren't representing the public, do we need new parties to do the job? Tom, you wrote about this week. Can you tell us your thoughts?
Yeah, so I wrote about it this week under the kind of headline of the rise of the not sures. And that's one thing which I've noticed and many other people have noticed as well, to be fair, which is that over the course of the past 6 months, kind of as the Brexit crunch has really been taking place, as Brexit's been passing through Parliament and hitting all of these roadblocks, this big kind of constitutional question of, you know, how does the public's desire to leave the European Union pan out, given that so much of the political class is either dead set against it or pursuing their own kind of, you know, particular agendas and particular battles within their own parties. One thing that was so striking is as all of this is going on, in a three-way race between Theresa May, Prime Minister, Jeremy Corbyn, leader of the Labour Party, and Not Sure has won practically every week in YouGov's tracking poll since basically July last year to January this year. And I think what it really just brought home, along with the statistics that you just quoted there from Comres, is that at a time of really kind of constitutional importance, at a time in which the future of British democracy is basically on the line, we have a political class which is arguably almost illegitimate. You know, they do not command mass support. This isn't just a question of two particularly uncharismatic and useless leaders. It goes right down to party affiliation. And I think that puts us in a really interesting and actually quite dangerous position in many respects, particularly as Leave voters, because what's happened, and this has been commented on by various political scientists, is that British politics is repolarised around the issue of Brexit. Yeah. This is something Sir John Curtis pointed out last year, which is that only about 9% identify very strongly with either the Labour Party or the Tory Party, or any political party for that matter, whereas 44% of people strongly identify with either Remain or Leave, and yet the two main political parties do not represent that new divide. If anything, they're trying to contain it, they're trying to squash it. And I think that just opens up a really interesting question about, are the parties now a block to that new realignment? Where is this new realignment going to come from? Is it going to come in time for us Leavers to actually see our will enacted, and what happens next? But I think it's just fascinating that at this hugely crucial time at which the political class are charged with such a huge undertaking, that they just don't enjoy particular popular support.
Ella?
Well, yeah, it's a really interesting question of what new parties need to emerge or new shifts need to happen. The answers at the moment are incredibly depressing or missing the marks. You've had a host of pop-up centrist parties like the Radicals, the Democrats, Spring the Party, Renew Britain, United for Change, now 12 together. All of them pretty embarrassing, really, and unable to kind of grasp what it actually is that people want. I don't think it necessarily is a centrist party. Then you also have things like Blair's former chief of staff, Jonathan Powell, has been meeting in J.K. Rowling's press offices to try and create a kind of basically an anti-Corbyn pro-European party backed by Rachel Riley from Countdown. I mean, you can imagine how attractive that's going to seem with most ordinary people. And then you've got the Brexit party supposedly being championed by Nigel Farage, who is under some kind of illusion that he is not just a great man of the people, but kind of holds popular support. I mean, forgetting the fact that UKIP's numbers when they, you know, in the height of the referendum was at about 4 million, then tanked after the referendum to about, you know, under 600,000. I mean, UKIP is not a party or holds a politics that people feel attracted to. So on all sides, it's just very obvious that no one actually grasps that people want something new, not a going back to a kind of Blairite version before Corbyn or some kind of throwback to the ridiculous politics of UKIP. it's just depressing to show that they can't get a handle on it. On the other hand, it's very exciting for those of us who do want something new, because I think people aren't willing to settle anymore. That's shown with their disinterest in both the main parties and with these new startup parties. So if someone did want to come along and do something different, I think now is a really interesting time to do that.
I'm totally fascinated by these new centrist parties that keep coming up and dying. Often it seems to be the case that someone gets a bit drunk and starts a party and then has to disband it. But, for instance, this United for Change party started by Simon Franks, which, had splits already before it even really began. But it has managed to raise £50 million. Now, that might not sound like a lot of money to an American listener, but bear in mind that at the last election, you're talking, the Tories spent about 18 million, Labour about 11 million. That is a huge amount of money. But then, who would vote for it? Essentially, they want to basically copy the Lib Dems. It's the kind of politics of the Lib Dems, both socially and economically. And it would probably appeal to the same constituency of the Lib Dems, which, as we know, is, around about 10% of the country max. And there seems to be this huge juncture between the opinions that are totally overrepresented in the pages of the Times, in the Guardian, the BBC, the Economist, and what people actually feel in the country at large. And, so many of the new centrist parties seem to want to appeal to that very narrow slither of voters.
There does seem to be an enthusiasm gap, because one of the interesting kind of paradoxes is that, as I was saying, kind of British politics is repolarised around this Brexit issue, and very much on both sides. We've pointed out previously that there's an awful lot of Remainers who are still Democrats and want to see Brexit carried through with, but nevertheless, it does represent some kind of values divide, on the question of democracy, technocracy, on the question of something more radical versus stability. It's quite clear that there is something there, but there is also this kind of enthusiasm gap, because there's no shortage of new centrist upstart parties. I thought it was interesting that United for Change, that one of their founder members has already broken off to form this 12 Together party, which refers to the 12 regions, which almost no one ever refers to. So it's kind of interesting. But at the same time, of course, on the Brexit side, you're seeing far less activity, far less money being raised. It does often fall to Nigel Farage, it seems, to think about launching something. And now he has backed this move from a former UKIPper who set up this Brexit party with this main aim of fighting the European elections if Article 50 is extended. Now, there does seem to be a fair bit of support, at least when you look at polls, for some kind of Brexit party, particularly if it's clear that Brexit is going to be thwarted. But at the same time, I think that, especially in a kind of kippery form, it's only ever going to work as a kind of protest vote, a kind of UKIP in 2014 at the European elections, people voting for it to make a point.
Yeah.
What I think all of these new parties actually reflect is that they kind of misunderstand what it takes to create a new political party. They kind of want to set up a brand, a website, a receptacle for people's frustrations on either side, rather than a party that has real roots in society, that has real kind of flesh to it, and that crucially grows up from the grassroots rather than something you just kind of create and hope people will flock to. It's a very kind of Blairite idea of politics, which is that you basically have a brand rather than a party. And I think that whilst a lot of people talk about being politically homeless these days, I think this void is most dangerous, of course, for Leave voters, because we don't have the support of powerful people in the establishment. 75% of MPs at the time of a referendum backed Remain. The only party currently in Parliament that at the time of the referendum was formally backing Brexit is the DUP.
There is some interesting polling around this question of a Brexit party that Matthew Goodwin has dug out. So, for instance, 73% of Leavers say they would vote for a new party on the right committed to leaving the EU. 70% of Leavers feel that main parties don't offer an appealing choice. That's true of all voters, actually. And 72% of Leavers feel the Tories are handling Brexit badly. So there does seem to be a space for a party. But the problem is that if such a party succeeded and we did leave the EU as promised on March the 29th, 2019, then what next? Actually, we should be looking to the future, a post-Brexit future. What can we do when we're outside of the EU? So a party that's purely designed for Brexit alone seems to be a bit of a non-starter. We need to be thinking long-term about how we represent people in politics.
Well, that's the exact problem, because Brexit has now been, by all sides, even the most ardent Leavers, it's been treated as just this sort of policy issue that you need to just get past. So you just need to either get May's deal through, or you need to just leave the European Union and then everything will be fine afterwards. I'm not saying that everything will be terrible afterwards, but the whole excitement for most Leave voters, or all of the ones that I know anyway, was that it wasn't just about leaving this institution. That was the first step it was the beginning of a whole different way of doing politics. That was why so many people cared about the sovereignty issue. It wasn't just because, the EU was the one thing that was blocking all progress in Britain. It was saying, from that new starting point, we can then start talking about the NHS, immigration, housing, in the light of a new Brexit Britain, which was a very different kind of playing field for politics. I would be thinking very seriously about whether or not to back a Brexit party, even if it was a Brexit protest party. Leavers have no political representation at the moment, and so anything is worth thinking about. Think about it, but also let's think bigger. If we're faced with a big decision of what kind of new politics do we want today post-Brexit, there's no need to settle at this point. I think there's time to be quite daring, perhaps say, well, let's rip it up and start again.
And it is just really exciting times as well. I think that's the thing, that amidst all of the kind of slow motion betrayal of Brexit in Parliament, it's really fascinating that the two main parties which have dominated British politics for, as long as anyone can remember effectively, are starting to crack under the weight of it. I mean, these parties, the first past the post system always kind of has created this kind of duopoly. And of course, that means that they always have to be broad churches and they're going to have competing interests and different views on all kinds of things. But the defining issue of the day is the Brexit issue, and that cuts across both of the main parties. One of the most exciting things about the Leave vote and its aftermath was that in the immediate aftermath, you kind of were wondering if both these parties were about to collapse. They kind of suddenly had no meaning. But whilst we've seen, of course, at the last election, you see, working class Leavers moving towards the Conservative Party, you see metropolitan Remainers bolting for the Labour Party, an attempt to kind of repolarise them almost against their wishes, because the party establishment want to try and bridge divides, want to try and smooth things over. It's quite clear that those parties cannot hold. The problem is, in order to crack that edifice, you do need some form of challenger, and that is what we're waiting for at this point.
Hi there. I hope you're enjoying the Spike podcast so far. And if you are, why not help us spread the word by giving us a rating and a review with your podcast provider? It won't take long, but it will make a huge difference for us. So we'd be massively grateful if you could take a tiny bit of your time to give us a rating and a review. Right, now back to the show. The French and Italian governments have been trading blows for months. Tensions escalated significantly last week when Italy's Deputy Prime Minister and leader of the populist Five-Star movement went to the outskirts of Paris to meet with the Gilets jaunes. This sparked the biggest diplomatic row between the two neighbouring countries since the Second World War. Tom, what's going on here, do you think?
Well, what I think we're seeing coming to a head here is this kind of divide across Europe and between European leaders, which has really been summed up over the past year as between kind of Salvini, the Interior Minister of Italy, and between Emmanuel Macron. Both the populist government of Italy, which was elected last summer, and Macron have really used one another as a foil, I think it's fair to say. When the Five-Star movement and the Lega coalition came to power, you had Macron quite clearly denouncing them, talking about the leprosy of populism growing up across Europe. And at the same time, Salvini in particular has used Macron as a foil for an aloof, technocratic EU establishment that is not only not listening to voters, but also incredibly hypocritical. The issue of migration has been very clear. The battle over who was going to take the Aquarius ship full of migrants, Salvini turning it away, but then pointing out that France were certainly not falling over themselves to take in those migrants. And what we're seeing really is that kind of coming to a head, particularly over Di Maio meeting the Yellow Vest. Now, it's fair to say that probably Di Maio was doing this as a bit of a stunt when the Five-Star movement came into power. They were, of course, came into power as the biggest party, yet very quickly the Lega, the more right-wing populist faction, has totally eclipsed them in terms of popularity and the polling numbers in particular. It's quite clear that ahead of the European elections in May, whilst Lega already have a kind of faction within the European Parliament of the kind of hard-right populists, Five-Star are looking for more kind of coalitions, and of course some Yellow Vests are going to stand in those European elections, etc. But the longer-term picture is one of a Europe which is, in terms of its leadership, if nothing else, cutting across these kind of populist versus Europhile divides, and just showing that kind of schism is not really going anywhere and is only really going to intensify, particularly as we go into those elections in May.
Ella?
Well, I mean, whatever you think about Italy, and there's definitely, I don't think that it's the kind of perfect populism going on there. I think the interesting thing has been how Macron is so embodied. He's, like 2 steps away from wearing a rah-rah skirt and being the kind of cheerleader expert on the EU. He's always promoted that as his kind of politics. And yet he's faced in his own country, he's, as you've reported, Fraser, firing on his own populace, the Gilets jaunes. He's shown himself to be completely at odds with any kind of desire to serve what French people want in terms of economic policy. Then translate that to how the EU is treating Italy. I mean, it's forced Italy to renew its proposed budget several times when Italy wants to do things like create a citizen's income and, make provisions for the unemployed, boost social services, with the backdrop of the fact that Italy has a giant unemployment crisis, about 30%, and 23% of people at risk of poverty. I mean, it's have that with then the EU saying, no, you cannot do anything to benefit your citizens, and Macron championing that. If you had to pick a side, I definitely wouldn't be picking Macron's side. And the picture of the populist revolt in Europe is varied, because obviously there are some, even within the Gilets jaunes, I mean, it's quite clear that there are left and right splits now, which means that it's not necessarily the kind of coherent movement that you might perhaps have wanted it to have been. But what is definitely clear is that European leaders are standing completely at odds, alongside the EU, completely at odds with their own populaces. And where that will go is unknown, but it's certainly not going to go in the EU's favour. It just can't.
And I think, the phenomenon of anti-establishment, anti-EU, populist parties, if you want to call them that, I mean, it's just steamrolling on. And according to a new report by the European Council on Foreign Relations, these types of parties are expected to win about 35% of the seats in the upcoming European elections, 250 seats in the European Parliament, which is a major shift in European politics. Just on this question of the Gilets jaunes, what's interesting, it reminds me of as we were talking about in the last conversation, this putative Brexit party. There's been a fair bit of polling on would French people theoretically vote for a yellow vest party. Around, 13%. We're talking about a party that's only been cobbled together, in the last few weeks, that has, about 13 candidates and 60 other places to fill, and people already would plump for that over the existing French parties. I mean, it's extraordinary. You think about the rise of the five-star movement. As you're right, Tom, as you say, they're floundering a bit at the moment, but they've gone from basically being an internet-led movement, something that started on chat rooms, and
led by a comedian,
into being, into basically coming top in the Italian elections in the summer. I mean, the potential for change here is extraordinary. I mean, of course, these parties have their weaknesses and their faults, but the fact is that we shouldn't see the changes in Europe as being one note, as being purely xenophobic or far right. There's actually lots of different interesting things happening, lots of different types of movement, partly, as you say, from some slightly more to the left, some slightly more to the right. There are things going on that are shaking things up, and I think that's definitely something we should welcome.
Definitely. And just on the sort of question of, as we were talking about this way in which the question of the European elections in Europe at the moment is being kind of pit as sort of Macron versus Salvini, as open versus closed, as good-natured centrism versus these kind of darker forces. I think it's important, as you say, to kind of pick that up. It's quite clear that many people that the populist revolt is taking different forms across Europe. And also I think it's important to not give people like Macron and even the kind of wannabe Macrons in this country trying to set up anti-Brexit parties more credit and more popular support than they actually have. And to see that kind of gap, all you've got to do is compare Salvini's popularity to Macron's popularity. Salvini, as of about October, I think his approval ratings were about 60% when he was kind of doing battle with France and other EU nations over the question of migration. There were pro-Salvini demonstrations in Rome. Yeah. And now you look at Macron, there's civil unrest on the streets. If one thing, there are splits within the Gilets jaunes, but they're definitely united on their hatred for Macron.
Yeah.
And his popularity, as we all know, has tanked. At points it's been dwindling around the low 20s in terms of his approval rating. So while, yes, this is the new battle, it isn't about two distinct demographic factions, one of which is very happy with the technocratic status quo, and then another set which want to upset it for nefarious xenophobic reasons. It's quite clear that the real split is between people like Macron, people of the old order, just trying to kind of doll themselves up in new clothes so that they can hang on to their positions of power, and these new upstarts of various different hues who are trying to upset that.
I mean, contrast just the approval rating of Macron versus the Gilets Jaunes. I mean, even after 13 weekends of civil unrest, 64% of French people support the Gilets Jaunes, according to a recent YouGov poll, and 74% of them agree that their protests are justified. I mean, this is absolutely extraordinary. I've said many times that I think the Gilets Jaunes are a progressive force for good, but I could also understand why, if you're a French citizen, you might be annoyed that there is a protest in your town every weekend stopping you from going to the petrol station or whatever. And yet the support remains incredibly high. There's an incredible momentum behind this movement. And so let's wait and see if it can turn into an electoral force as well. And if it can really start to challenge people like Macron, start to challenge the EU establishment in the polls as well as on the streets. I'd just like to take a really quick moment to say a massive thank you to everyone who's been donating to Spiked. I know many of you who listen to this podcast have donated to us in the past or make monthly donations, and it's thanks to your contributions and generosity that we can keep going and growing. Spiked has some very exciting plans for the year ahead with our podcasts, and we need the help of listeners and readers like you to make them happen. So, if you haven't before, please do consider making a donation, or even better, setting up a monthly donation. It's really easy to do. Just go to spiked-online.com and click the red donate button in the top right corner. Thank you. Now, back to the show. Campus censorship is in the news again, and the government has recently produced new guidance on upholding free speech at universities. But many of the worst culprits in the campus culture wars simply deny there is any problem. They say it's a myth, cooked up by the media. Ella, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, there's one recent example that can just put to bed the idea that this is a myth, the problem of campus censorship. Bristol Students' Union stopped the Bristol Free Speech Society from inviting a speaker to an event questioning whether there is a problem with free speech on campus, right? So it cancelled a speaker for a free speech event held by the Free Speech Society. It's obvious that this is an issue. And the speaker, Angela Sophocleous, who was a student from Durham, was stopped from coming simply because he had previously retweeted a Spectator article which questioned the idea of trans and self-ID. I mean, this is utterly outrageous, but they gave some kind of reason why they were kind of postponing the event and gave the society very little time to reorganise it. But basically, this was quite a clear-cut example of censorship.
Yeah.
This has been going on for a long time. I remember when we were doing the Spiked Free Speech University rankings, Lincoln, a student society at Lincoln got banned from social media by its students' union for sharing our results, for simply sharing data.
With some zip mouth emojis, I seem to remember.
Yeah.
Perfect.
So it's utterly mad. And the thing is, we and people who are serious about free speech keep flagging these incidents, and keep saying this is a real issue, not just because we want students to be able to invite who they like, but it's creating a wider culture on campus of fear around open discussion. And the response from student union leaders and the NUS and people who are hostile to free speech on campus is this really kind of patronising and really degrading view of just calm down, you're making such a big deal. They take the piss and say, oh, free speech and all that kind of thing. Yeah. It's really insidious and it really has to be challenged.
Yeah, I mean, as you say, I mean, in this Bristol case, the SU just deny that there was any censorship going on. They say, oh, we believe in free expression, blah, blah, blah. They cite these bogus security reasons, quote unquote. And, they say they even had consultations with the police to say, Angela Sophocleous is somehow a threat, is somehow going to whip people up into such a frenzy that they cannot hold a discussion. I mean, these kinds of excuses crop up all the time. If you're hosting a controversial speaker or trying to discuss a sensitive issue, basically you're just thrown all these bureaucratic hurdles, which sometimes can be insurmountable. Sometimes you're asked to, your speakers have to send their speeches in advance to be vetted. Sometimes you need to be able to organise safe space marshals to come to your event, so people from the SU have to be available to sit there and listen to find out if any naughty words are going to be said, which apparently is not a threat to free speech in their world. So technically, yes, nowadays nobody even has to explicitly ban someone, but the effect on free speech is the same. And I remember a couple of years ago when there were these rows over no platforming, and a lot of SU types would just say, well, this person hasn't specifically been no platformed. You know, they would cite the fact that there's only about 4 or 5, you know, various groups from Islamists to far right groups like National Action who are on the NUS's no platform list. But the effect is still the same. They're making a completely disingenuous, you know, technical distinction between no platforming and some other form of censorship.
Definitely. In some respects, I think this kind of very duplicitous argument they're making now is showing that we're making a little bit of progress, because when we first started really digging into this issue, running campaigns around it, doing the Free Speech University rankings, broadly speaking, people would say, we're proud of our, you know, record of censorship. You know, why would you want someone who's so offensive coming to campus and upsetting everyone? Now what they're trying to do, as you say, Fraser, is make these incredibly technical distinctions, trying to do things in a very underhanded way, only ever blaming security concerns rather than just openly saying that we do not want this sort of person on campus, and also making these really spurious arguments. So a couple of weeks ago, the Equality and Human Rights Commission put out this guidance, which was nominally about effectively trying to create a more robust standard for how you deal with free speech issues on campus. It's worth noting that universities and students' unions are subject to all kinds of like competing legal obligations, which really do give them, if nothing else, a lot of cover to pull off the kinds of tricks that you've been talking about. In a way, the guidance didn't tell us anything we didn't already know, and we wrote about it on Spite. But what was most interesting for me, at least, was the kind of quotes that came attached to it from the National Union of Students, from Universities UK, which is the kind of big universities group, is that they're effectively trying to say that this wasn't a problem whatsoever, and making these really ridiculous arguments, saying that, of course, on campus, we hold thousands of events every year and none of those are banned. And of course, our own research suggests that over about the past 3 years or so, there's maybe been about 12 events at mainstream universities which have been shut down that we can track. But at the same time, no one is suggesting that it's, you know, every other geography conference or every other speaker on advanced mathematics is being hounded off campus. It's a ridiculous argument, and it misses the fact that so much of the censorship is either underhand, as you said, or preemptive. You know, we found that around 50% of universities have policies warning students and speakers away from offending faith groups or wading into questions of religion. No platform is a preemptive policy. You're not allowed to invite these people in the first place for them to then be put on and then banned. So there's an awful lot of bad faith in this discussion. It's ridiculous to see the main purveyors of campus censorship trying to then turn around and say it's not happening. And I think this story at Bristol this week, as well as Peter Hitchens at Portsmouth the other week, having his talk moved at the last minute because allegedly it clashed with LGBT History Month, and that was something which could be potentially too offensive, has just proven that they haven't got a leg to stand on when it comes to this.
It is these kind of underhanded methods. I remember I was invited to a debate in Aberystwyth before Christmas on feminism, and we had a really good debate, and there was a woman in the audience who kind of locked eyes with me for the entire event and was noting down everything I said, and I thought, this is brilliant, I've got a fan, you know, I felt really good about myself. And then she came up to the student organizer afterwards and said, I've been monitoring your entire event because I've been watching out for any hate speech. I'm a trade union representative and I'm here at the behest of the Students' Union and the LGBT Society. And I mean, it was really horrible.
It's not sinister at all.
It's not sinister at all. It didn't, you know, I wasn't that fazed by it, but the student was really frightened because she was asking me, am I going to get into trouble? And I had to actually say, well, it's not out of the realms of possibility that you might get into trouble these days. And that kind of thing means that she'll think twice about putting on another event. As it happens, people did get really heated and we had a really fiery debate, but we all went to the pub afterwards and had a good time and talked about it. The problem is that student unions and the NUS particularly have really drilled down on this focus on mental health. They're like, their modus operandi now is to panic about students' mental health. And that's how they justify all of these policies, because they say if there is the possibility for harm to be created, if someone feels uncomfortable even or stressed out or upset, which is completely subjective, then they will ban speakers. So we have for a long time challenge the sort of the legal aspects of it, the policy aspects of it, but we've also said this is not simply an issue in which if you wipe away policies or stop the NUS from putting prohibitions down on universities that it will go away. This is a much more wide-reaching culture of fear of harm that needs to be challenged on campus.
Well, the important point as well to make in all of this is the fact that this really comes in the midst of this attempt from government to try and sort out the free speech issue on campus as they see it, basically by trailing a kind of pro-free speech crackdown, which is what these guidelines are a part of. There's been the Office for Students, this kind of newly minted universities regulator, where at one point it was suggested they would have a role in potentially even defunding universities that fail to uphold their legal obligations. The one thing in the guidance which I think is genuinely controversial, and rightly so, is the fact that it implies quite heavily that students' unions, actually no platforming speakers, could potentially be illegal, which is actually a bit of a break from the understanding up to now, which is that students' unions are independent charities and can make their own rules. But what I think that reminds us of is the fact that the fight for free speech on campus cannot be a legalistic one. Yeah. It certainly can't be one led by the state. You can't fight one form of a liberalism with another, and it really needs to come from the bottom up. The problem is that I think the last couple of weeks, the disingenuousness, the saying that censorship isn't going on even as they're literally enacting censorship, just shows what a mountain to climb there still is, I guess.
You've been listening to the Spike podcast. If you've enjoyed the show, don't forget to give us a rating, a review, or even make a donation. We'll be back next week, but for more Spike content every day, visit spiked-online.com.